everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome of course if you're new. Today I'm coming at you with another recent reads video. I'm going to be telling you about all of the books that I read in October. I'm sorry that this video is a little bit late. I've been feeling really busy recently and I think that's only going to continue as we get closer and closer to Christmas, but I will try and film for you whenever I can. Speaking of Christmas, I am so in the festive spirit right now. If you saw any of my videos this time last year, then you'll probably know that I am Christmas mad. It's just my absolute favorite time of the year and I'm just so happy that we're here again. If you love the festive season as much as I do, then I hope you're starting to get into the swing of things and are having a great time. So on to the books that I read in October. The first book that I picked up was a poetry collection, and that one was Ariel by Sylvia Plath. This is the first full poetry collection I have ever read by Sylvia Plath, and unfortunately it didn't quite have the impact on me that I hoped it would. Don't get me wrong, there was a lot that I liked about this collection. The poetry felt very raw, it was very intense and personal. I really felt as though I was getting an insight into Sylvia Plath's mind. I enjoyed the style of the poems in here, I enjoyed the differing structures and the language choices and the differing rhythms. Everything was very well crafted and it felt very intentional. I just had a bit of difficulty figuring out what those intentions were. So while I enjoyed the feeling of the poems and I could tell that Sylvia Plath was doing something in them, I just didn't feel as though I was garnering much meaning from them. I didn't really feel as though I knew where to start in terms of picking the poems apart to find more meaning in them, and so they didn't ultimately give me much to think about. I do feel as though this is more due to my reading of the collection and my mindset I was in while I was reading the collection, rather than the poetry being one-dimensional or having any fault on the part of the author. There was definitely more stuff in here that I wasn't quite reaching. My fingers brushed it a time or two, but it evaded me. As such, I will definitely be reading more poetry by Plath in the future. I will definitely reread this one at some point in the future as well, and then hopefully I can give it the really good go that it deserves and ultimately get more from it. It just didn't really happen for me this time for whatever reason. So there was definitely a lot to admire in here, and I definitely want to go back and read more Plath in the future, but for now this one is staying at a 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in October was Godsend by John Ray. This novel tells the story of an 18-year-old American girl called Aiden who travels to Pakistan to study Islam at a madrasa. To do so, she must take on the identity of a young man, and when she gets there, things spiral and she ends up in situations that she didn't expect. So unfortunately, I didn't really like this book at all. I didn't really feel like it did anything, and while I was reading, it wasn't clear to me what the author was actually trying to achieve through writing this book, which isn't good. So initially I found the premise of this book to be really interesting. Aiden's faith should be central to the story, as should her identity in the face of all of this change, and both of those things sounded really, really interesting to me. I was also really intrigued by the huge cultural shift that happens in this novel, and I went into it feeling really open to learning as much as I could. But I didn't actually feel as though this novel allowed me to explore all of these themes in the way that it was presumably set up to do. I didn't get to know Aiden as a character throughout this book. I didn't feel as though I really learned much about her. I didn't know why she did certain things or why she believed certain things, and that ultimately made me care little about her throughout. Weak characterization also occurred throughout the rest of the book as well. There was a side character who was Aiden's best friend who really had the potential to be a really interesting character. There was a complex relationship there, there was some kind of tension between the two and between their beliefs, and this could have been really, really interesting, but John Ray just didn't use this opportunity at all. I wasn't emotionally affected by this book, which is surprising considering the subject matter. There were definitely a few moments in here that should have really hit me hard, but they didn't. I also wasn't philosophically affected. I didn't feel as though I learned anything, which really, really frustrated me. There was so much wasted potential in this book. In terms of other aspects of this book, the writing was okay. There were definitely times when it was quite nice, which was refreshing. But overall, this book was just disappointing. It wasn't terrible in any way, but it just didn't do enough. And ultimately, I wouldn't really recommend it to anyone. In the end, I gave Godsend 2.5 stars. The next book that I read in October was The Age of Magic by Ben Okri. This is the story of a group of filmmakers who travel together from Paris to a Swiss village to make a documentary. This is a book that I've been meaning to pick up for a long time, and I actually read it with my booktube friends Matt, Beth and Sharon. So we didn't buddy read this book in the traditional sense. We actually all read the exact same copy, annotating it with our notes and comments and thoughts before posting the book onto the next person when we were done. My reading experience of this book was so cool. I absolutely loved it. There was something so nice about reading the physical book that your friend has just read and passed on to you. And I was actually last in the queue as well, so when I read it and added my comments, I could read everyone else's comments that had come before me, which was so cool. You three are all just so lovely and smart and funny, and I absolutely loved reading all of your comments. It was so nice. Unfortunately though, it does have to be said that the majority of us didn't actually really like this book, which was a shame. I personally didn't get on with the book. I gave it 2 stars. Matt quite liked it. He gave it 4 stars. Sharon found it kind of similar to me. She gave it between 2 and 3 stars, and Beth actually DNF'd it. This book is clearly intended to be very beautiful and poetic, quite philosophical and reflective, but unfortunately I just found it to be quite forced and self-indulgent. The structure of the book was quite interesting. It's split into really short chapters. Some of them are as short as 1 line, I think, and I do enjoy books that play around with structure, so this was something that intrigued me, and I do have to say that I do think it added to the sense of journey moving forward throughout the book. But this book was full of quotable musings and philosophical thoughts on every page over and over and over again, and the whole thing was just a little bit on the nose for me. The author is clearly very smart and he had a lot of thoughts and things that he wanted to say in the book, but it ended up feeling as though he was just bashing you over the head with all of his thoughts and didn't really leave any room for the reader to have their own space or their own ideas. It really just felt as though Ben Okri was trying so hard all the way through. In terms of the writing, it was actually pretty good. There were definitely moments of really beautiful imagery and descriptions. There were moments when Ben Okri would have me and I'd be like, ooh, and then he would just lose me all over again. I also didn't really feel invested in the characters or their story basically at all. So to sum all of this up, it was very clear to me what the author was trying to achieve throughout this book, but it just didn't really work for me. I wasn't particularly impressed. I wasn't inspired. The book didn't really have much of an impact on me, and ultimately I was just left feeling pretty cold. Even though I didn't really like the book, the actual reading experience for me was such a delight. It was so much fun. I would totally be up for buddy reading books like that again with some other friends. It was just super, super nice. So in the end, I ended up giving The Age of Magic 2 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in October was a fantasy book, and that was Falling Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes. I was massively craving some fantasy at the beginning of October, and that was totally due to the fact that autumn had just arrived and I just moved into my new flat and I made the living room so nice and cozy. I basically just wanted to spend all of my time inside on the sofa with a blanket and a cup of tea with a really good, fun, fast-paced, magical book. Cam and I had actually had this one on our shelves for a couple of years, and I knew it was one that I was going to enjoy when I finally picked it up. I'd heard that it was really fun and fast-paced and quite easy to read, and that's exactly what I wanted and what I got. This novel focuses on the 3 kingdoms of Mythica, where magic has been long forgotten and peace has reigned for centuries. In this book, the peace is inevitably challenged and some characters from all over Mythica become entwined in each other's lives. I really liked the setup of this book focusing on the 3 different kingdoms and getting to learn about characters from each one. We all know that I'm a sucker for different characters from different backgrounds and getting to read from the perspectives of all of them and having all of their storylines come together in the end. I really liked all of the characters in here as well. We have a privileged princess from one realm and a rebel who's organising an uprising in another, and a 16-year-old sorceress in another, and I genuinely enjoyed reading about all of the different perspectives just as much as each other, which is really great. I also just really enjoyed being back in a magical land, learning about these kingdoms and their histories and their magic was so interesting and engrossing for me. The pacing of the book was definitely pretty fast. It kept me reading, it kept me on my toes. Although I do have to say that there wasn't a ton of plot in this book. It was clearly a setup for the rest of the series, and I do hear that the rest of the series actually improves, but for me, there was enough going on. Taking a step back from my reading experience of this book, there are definitely some things that weren't particularly well executed, I can't lie. Some of the writing was really generic and really predictable. Morgan Rhodes actually used the line, "I let out a breath I never knew I was holding," which I've rarely encountered because I don't really read much YA, I've just heard about it. But she actually did that. I definitely cringed a few times while I was reading. It was a bit too insta-lovey for my liking. At the time when I was reading it, one side of my brain was going, that's kind of ridiculous, that's kind of silly. But it was basically all just perfect for me at the time I was reading it. It was just what I wanted, and so I don't suppose it really matters. I loved my reading experience of it. It gave me all of those cozy reading feels that I wanted, and I had a good time. So in the end, I gave Falling Kingdoms 3.5 stars. And the final book that I read in October was a classic, and that was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I've read works by Charlotte Bronte and Emily Bronte in the past, but this was actually my first Anne Bronte, and I absolutely loved it. It was everything that I hoped it would be. So this novel follows the story of a woman called Helen who flees an abusive marriage with her young son to make a new life for herself in a small village as a painter. Throughout the novel, we get to learn both about the community's reaction to Helen and also about her past. This book is amazing, if only because of the themes it tackles and its central message. It cannot be overstated how deeply controversial it would have been at the time for Anne Bronte to write about a single woman fleeing her abusive husband to start her own life, and as a single mother and an artist as well. Anne Bronte just smashes the idea that women should be submissive, quiet angels in the household throughout this book, and I couldn't love that more. But this book is also just the really wonderful and engaging story I hoped it would be. I absolutely loved Helen as a protagonist. I was super rooting for her all the way through. I loved the layered narrative and being allowed to see her from the perspective of a male neighbour when she moves to the new village, and also getting to read her diary entries from when she was younger and falling in love and ending up in an abusive marriage. This book definitely has the slightly gothic feel to it that the Bronte stories usually do. There's the creepy windswept moorlands and the mysterious woman and the secret drenched romance. And while this isn't typically my favourite kind of tone to a Victorian novel, Anne Bronte actually made this work for me in a way that the other Bronte sisters haven't up to this point. I also love that this novel really tackles some of the problematic features of other Bronte works, which I've definitely struggled with reading in the past. For example, there is this recurring idea that violent, heavily drinking men are attractive, and Anne Bronte says they're not. I don't know if this was a conscious critique of the other Bronte sisters by Anne, but I feel like it must have been. I just loved this book. It gave me the really cozy, comforting feel that I always get when I read these kind of classics, but I also found it to be really empowering and uplifting. And in the end, I gave The Tenant of Wildfell Hall 4 out of 5 stars. So those were all the books that I read in October. A bit of a weird mix, as per usual, I suppose. I'd love to know if you guys have read any of these books. If you have, do we agree on them? Do we disagree? I would love to know your thoughts on them down below. And also please tell me what you've been reading recently, if there's anything you've been particularly loving. Thanks so much for watching this video, everyone. I appreciate it so much, and I will hopefully see you again soon with another video. Bye.